This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 153 of Slick Talk. I'm your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Today I want to take you through 3 different samples I was working on during the day where I noticed that all 3 gave a nice overview of the range of systems that we'll see an oil sample from and how we evaluate these results differently depending on what type of system it is that you're sampling. So 3 different oils, 3 different narratives, 3 different breakdowns where I can tell you what these results meant to the client and what they need to do based on how things turned out. I'm going to start things off with a sample from a Honda motorcycle engine. As far as highlights on the page, things that we needed to mark in bold, the only thing slightly out of line was the viscosity. Now, when it comes to a motorcycle engine, a low viscosity is common even when everything else looks great. The reason being these engines can harmlessly shear the oil down. When that happens, the viscosity will end up lower than the expected range for whatever it is you're sampling, but typically that's not a concern. I say typically because we also know how to evaluate when a viscosity is low, even in the context of shearing, because we can lean on sample history that we've accumulated, gaining a frame of reference to understand if a result is unusual. So not merely looking at a low reading and calling it good, but understanding what's typical for that type of engine. And in this case, the viscosity was a little low, but again, not unusually so for this particular engine type. With the low viscosity being the only thing out of line, at face value, it looked like this was going to be a great report. But of course, we don't merely judge things at face value. We want to dig a little deeper. And as such, I had to go through the numbers and see how the metals looked compared to averages, how much metal was being made on a per mile basis as well, because sometimes you'll get samples where the interval that the customer has chosen is shorter or longer than what we see on average. So taking that into consideration matters as well. But even after digging into the details, things still looked great overall. The viscosity was low, sure, but again, we knew a likely reason. And we also were able to test the flash point, which was high enough to rule out any measurable fuel. And with that, the viscosity was the only thing in need of a highlight, and again, not a concern. One thing that was interesting, though, was that additive levels were almost perfectly average. And the reason I bring this up is often that's not the case. And often one thing customers will have questions about is why their additive levels don't match up with averages. So we'll spend a good portion of our day either over the phone or in an email letting people know that, a magnesium level or calcium not being average, that's okay because those vary depending on the brand or blend you're running. But sometimes, as in this instance, the additive levels do end up almost perfectly average. It was something that I just don't see all that often. So it was kind of a pleasant surprise, but again, nothing notable as far as engine health and not a concern, even if that wasn't to be the case. But it's something that stood out to me as interesting because you see such a wide range of brands or blends that often you just don't have average additive levels. The elements that help provide anti-wear or they work as detergent dispersants to hold particles in suspensions so they can be filtered. It was interesting. Again, just a curiosity, not a concern, but knowable all the same given what I typically see in a sample. At the end of the day, this owner sending in the first sample from their Honda motorcycle had to walk away feeling pretty good given that the only thing we marked in bold wasn't even a concern. Metals spoke to healthy wear, and nothing looked like a potential problem. So going forward, we just want to see steady trends emerge as that will tell us that engine is continuing its ways of wearing well. Next up, I had a sample from a Ford 6.7-liter Power Stroke engine. Now, this sample was from a new-to-them truck. And in that instance, I'm always conscious of the fact that you have to be a little on edge if you're the client sending this in. You've made the investment to buy the truck, and then, of course, you have to worry about how that engine is doing, how the microscopic metals compare, even after the purchase is made, and then living with the results, responding to them if there's anything that's a concern. I'm aware of all of that, and I definitely feel for them as someone who's had to buy a used car before. You want to know that your investment was a good one. So it feels even better when I, the analyst, am able to pass along a report that's packed with plenty of good news. With this being a baseline sample, the first one from their truck, we started with a comparison to our averages. And when it comes to a 6.7 liter Power Stroke, that's an engine that we have a strong average file in place for comparison. So they know they're getting a good read on things compared to what's typical. And better yet, these results simply matched up very well. We didn't have any concerns to pass along when it comes to wear metals because they matched up well with averages, and we didn't see any signs of contamination. The only thing slightly out of line was, again, the viscosity. It was a little low, but in this case, we're talking about a used vehicle purchase where they didn't have great service records. So it's possible that the oil going in was thinner than what they anticipated. And this happens on a fairly routine basis, whether it's a little low or a little high. The viscosity can vary from expectation, but that does not mean it's a concern. So it's possible in this case, the last owner was actually using a 1030. The customer looked at the manual. They expected a 5 or 1540. This sort of situation comes up fairly often in a recent purchase. And again, we can rely on the flashpoint to rule out any measurable fuel. And when fuel is not the reason, a low viscosity is just rarely anything to lose sleep over because, as I stated earlier, this engine had wear metals that looked fantastic. So whether that was a 1030, whether that was a 540, the point is the oil did a good job. If it didn't, the engine wouldn't be wearing well. So it was one of those instances where it's curious, but not a concern. Next up, I want to talk about a port engine sample. This was a Yanmar diesel. And importantly, when we're looking at a port and starboard, what we're going to do is we're going to not just compare them to average, we're going to compare to how the engine on the other side is doing, because not every vessel is seeing the same operation. So averages are, of course, a meaningful baseline. But one thing we look for closely in a pair of engines is whether or not one is wearing much differently than its twin, because when that's the case, that can be pretty strong evidence of a problem. And this was one particular instance where the port engine was creating quite a bit more lead, both compared to average and its twin on the other side. That speaks to the bearings wearing more than they should. So unfortunately, this is a situation where we had to alert the customer to a potential problem, one that appeared to be in the fairly early stages because we're not seeing excess copper and tin that can often show up when a problem is going from bad to worse. But the trend as well as the high level was concerning because this wasn't the first sample from the port engine, this was the third. And we could see that lead was steadily climbing. When you have a trend, a result that over the course of 3 samples or more is proving itself to be a steady increase, that is the time to consider a problem. And this is what it looked like in this case as lead climbed again and again. And we're not seeing the same trend on the other side. Something is causing that port engine to wear significantly more than its twin. The good news is we can at least speed up the diagnostic process for this owner by letting them know we're not seeing contamination that would likely cause it. This doesn't appear to be related to water or fuel or abrasive dirt debris. The oil filtration was good. The oil itself was holding up well. Now, that may not tell them why this bearing problem cropped up, but it can cross items off the list. And of course, let them know that a problem appears to be brewing in the early stages before they suffer an unexpected failure. Because again, we're looking at metals that are microscopic, and we're also finding everything else in good shape other than that high lead level. So it's not all good news, unfortunately, in this trio of samples, but it is a wide range. It shows you that we can run into just about anything. I was working on these one right after another, and that's a pretty typical day. You pull up a sample and it may not even be oil. We may be looking at gasoline, we may be looking at coolant, maybe looking at turbine oil. Whatever the case may be, we'll be ready to tell you what's typical for that system and how your results compare. And if they don't match up with what's typical, that isn't necessarily a problem either. We know to compare a port to a starboard. We know to look at whether or not that engine type is known to shear oil down and whether or not that means a low viscosity makes sense. Or if you're in a pre-buy situation, knowing to acknowledge that inconsistent service records can sometimes result in an oil not testing like you might expect it to, but also understanding whether or not an in-spec or out-of-spec result warrants concern. That's all in a regular day of looking at oil, or it may even be fuel, may even be coolant. We're ready to handle all of the above. And if you have questions about what all goes into our testing, don't hesitate to reach out. Meanwhile, we'll be back to the data, helping people understand what is or isn't a problem and what they might need to do next. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.